Good afternoon, everyone. Can I convince a couple of people to move down this way? There'll be great rewards for those. I won't say where, but there will be great rewards. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. My name is Shaun Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, David Buckley. David is an assistant professor of political science and Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville. As we're going to see, his research focuses on religion and politics, and in particular on the contentious relationship between religious movements and democracy. His book, Faithful to Secularism, The Religious Politics of Democracy in Ireland, Senegal, and the Philippines, received the 2018 Religion and International Relations Book Award from the International Studies Association, and his award-winning research has appeared in leading journals of political science and media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. And then David, in a career-killing move, was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, a very nefarious organization full of shady characters in the U.S. Department of State. This is also something of a homecoming, I think, for David. David did his PhD work here at Georgetown University not so many years ago, and so we're delighted that he can be with us. Thank you for coming today. I think after David's presentation, we're just going to spend the balance of time really in Q&A and dialogue with David. So take your notes, pay attention, and let's have lots of good questions for David. Join me in welcoming David today. Thank you.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Shaun. Unlike Professor Casey, I stayed on at the State Department through late July, so my recovery from the shock is still at a sort of earlier stage. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for all of you for being here. It's fun to be here and also fun to see friends and old colleagues around the table. So I'll try to talk for about 45 minutes today about the project that is behind this book, but then also about how the framework that I developed in the book may or may not be holding up in light of developments in the Philippines, one of the cases where I've spent a good bit of research focus in the book. Just to be clear, as I was doing field research for this project, President Duterte was simply Mayor Duterte, and while he's mentioned in the book, because I had time to throw a few sentences in before it went to press, that was not sort of the main focus of the book. And so one of the things that I hope to do today is to, first of all, sort of set out, and there we go, did it already here, okay, set out sort of the project's overview on the theoretical side of things, what the book project is about. But then what I really want to spend most of my time doing and hope to talk with you all about is how that project about the institutional relationship between religion and democracy is or is not holding up in light of the past 12 to 18 months in Philippine politics. And in particular, this idea of benevolent secularism that I try to develop in the book, and the framework that I tried to set out about how these institutions could stabilize the religion-politics relationship, even during periods of great political instability. Is there evidence that that's happening in the Philippines or not? And I sort of to preview where I'll go at the end of the talk, I do think that there's some evidence, right, that some of the mechanisms through which this benevolent secular institutional relationship should stabilize democratic institutions. Some of that is going on, and I'll point to some of that evidence. But I do think that actually there are questions about really the future of religious politics in our sort of global populist moment that the Philippines raises that are kind of outside the framework of the book, and where the book maybe is already on its way to a second edition, maybe not to being thrown out entirely. Okay, so before we get to the Philippines, just a little bit of background. So for, I'm sure those of you around the table here, it's not news that religion and democracy can be tense partners. So we certainly have examples ranging from the South Africa transition to the People Power Revolution in the Philippines, where sort of the iconic images of democratization and political stability are closely tied to political and religious elites collaborating together. It's not news probably to most of us around the table here. And it's also probably not news that at times religion and democracy can make for for more tense and contentious bedfellows, whether it's the rise of religious political parties in places like Israel, or in parts of South Asia, or even close to home, right? So we know that the religion and democracy relationship cannot always be as rosy as is sometimes depicted in these iconic transitional moments in places like South Africa and the Philippines. Just to give you all, for those who may not have a background as comparative political scientists, sort of a sense for how comparativists, and that's what I am, a comparative political scientist, tried to make sense of religion and democracy, sort of intellectually, historically. I would argue that sort of early on there were sort of two phases. One was that essentially just didn't need to be studied, right? That sort of the future of religion and democratic consolidation was maybe an object of historical curiosity, but not something that needed a whole lot of contemporary attention. And that then, particularly in sort of a post-September 11th world, there was a second phase where political scientists started to pay attention mostly to be worried, right? That sort of religion could be a significant, actually, factor in introducing irrationality and fanaticism and fundamentalism into democratic politics. I think that, happily, comparativists have started to move past either of these two options, right? That sort of religion is necessarily a threat or is sort of irrelevant. And in the project, in the book, what I tried to do is sort of draw on a framework that the recently passed on political scientist Al Steppen, one of the great comparativists of his generation, set out what he called the twin tolerations between religion and democracy, right? Trying to argue that on the one hand, just empirically, looking around the world at the institutional relationship between religion and democracy, it's clear that, in fact, our potentially sort of American-driven assumptions about the need to separate religion and state in order for democracy to smoothly function just doesn't bear up to the empirical record, right? If we look all around the world in comparative perspective, it's obvious that there's a wide variety of institutional relationships that are compatible with democracy. And so what instead Al tried to develop in his own work on this topic was this idea of the twin tolerations, that so long as there was a basic toleration by religion of the state in policy formation and implementation, and so long as there's a basic toleration by the state for religion, both individual religious freedom in private but also public manifestations of religion, as long as you are meeting these sort of standards, there were all sorts of different institutional relationships, ranging from formal religious establishment in places like the UK to more sort of plural religious models in places like India that would be broadly considered compatible with democracy. Right? I think that reorienting our thinking on religion and democracy in this way helped political scientists and comparativists realize that our job was not necessarily to see where religion and state were separated or not, but actually sort of the more diverse and contextual institutional relationships between religion and democratic politics, and how those institutional relationships may map on to the twin tolerations. I'll go through this very quickly, actually, because we don't need too much of the social science theory here. But there were scholars tied to modernization theory who pointed to the impact of economic development, scholars tied to rational choice competition who pointed to the importance of religious fragmentation, scholars tied to sort of certain forms of political cultural analysis who emphasized the importance of moderate religious networks, usually code for moderate Muslims, although not always. That's fine, all good in some ways, although an incomplete scholarship that's out there. But what I try to do in the project, building on research from others, is to point to instead the importance of political institutions. I don't know how I'm continuing to do that. So that button down there. Turning to political institutions, and in fact, the idea that in fact what might be really important in stabilizing the twin tolerations is not so much the ideological moderation of key religious actors, but instead the institutional context that can encourage strong relationships across religious and secular boundaries. Again, this sort of existing research from scholars like Dan Philpott and Ahmet Kuru sort of set a foundation that was important to build on, and I think raised some important questions. So Kuru's research in particular on varieties of secularism really focused on the difference between Turkey and France and the United States. And as I was thinking about this project and the cases that make up the project, the sort of pressing question that came on my plate was, well, what about varieties of secularism that aren't either sort of aggressive and assertive in the French laïque model, or passive and sort of libertarian in the idealized American model anyway, where the government is actually quite involved in intentionally bringing religion into public life, although without having a form of religious establishment. A second and sort of distinct question is, how can we start to trace how institutions matter for patterns of social cleavage? So again, in other words, how do institutions shape interreligious relationships, relationships between a religious majority and minority, or tensions or alliances between religious and secular actors in society? And then finally, in places where the twin tolerations sort of emerge, how do they endure challenging periods when revisionist movements, whether those are religious sort of fundamentalists of different kinds, or, and it's important to remember that this could be an or, secularist challengers of different kinds trying to destabilize the twin tolerations. How do institutions shape the politics of those kinds of periods of political instability? And so that's what led in then to this project. I'll just very briefly give a sense of what I try to do in the project. I'm happy to answer more detailed questions about this, but I want to get to the Philippines pretty quickly. My basic goal in the project was, first of all, to set out this institutional concept, this institutional variety of what I call benevolent secularism in the project. It's actually a concept that term very much out of the Philippine case. The Philippine Supreme Court has actually referred to the institutional relationship between religion and state there as being one of benevolent secularism in a very important Supreme Court case there. And then after developing what I mean by that concept, which I'll talk about on the next slide, trying to trace the ways, causally, I think, that institutions matter, that they matter for changing the preferences of key actors over the place of religion and politics, and in particular, that they matter for building social ties and social cohesion between religious and secular actors who are dedicated to maintaining the twin tolerations in public life, and thus that when periods of instability threaten for whatever reason, the institutions form a set of social relationships that can be very important to stabilizing religious politics during those threatening periods. Just to briefly run through what I mean by benevolent secularism, it's a sort of a three-part institutional package, right? At a basic level, it's an institutional variety where the state actively encourages public religious involvement, but with three very sort of mutually essential conditions. First of all, there is a basic differentiation between religious and state institutions. So there's no state church, there's no state mosque. Second, that there's institutionalized religion-state cooperation. Sometimes this is funding, for instance, funding of religious schools. Sometimes it's policy input, for instance, consultations and development of public health policy or disaster response policy, a wide range of issues that could come up. And then finally, and this is an important one, that there's a certain principled distance that's maintained. This is a term that comes out of the work of Rajiv Bhargava, a scholar of religion in Indian public life. The idea that this can't just be code for, the religion-state cooperation in particular, can't be code for privileging one group over another, that there needs to be a kind of even-handedness and a quality of opportunity, I think it's fair to say, rather than a quality of outcome. So in other words, if you're in a country where one religious tradition is much more involved in public health infrastructure, they are going to be more involved in that cooperation at the second level, right? But that in theory, there's no sort of barrier to that kind of involvement extending to other religious communities if the opportunity is appropriate. Right? The point is that this is a variety of religion-state relationship, I think, that's not New York or Paris, right? That is certainly not the kind of anti-clerical laïc tradition that has at times characterized France and at times characterized Turkey. But that it's also not a sort of hands-off kind of state libertarian model that we at least idealize about ourselves here in the States, although whether we live up to that ideal at times is questionable. That there's actually sort of active state involvement in religious affairs in these countries that doesn't fit with either the passive or the assertive models that other scholars have pointed to, that it's an explicitly sort of positive, at least aspiration for engagement. Okay, so how does this matter then for stabilizing the twin tolerations? What I try to argue in the book is that there are actually a series of mechanisms through which I think this operates. On the one hand, because these institutions encourage public collaboration and cooperation between state and religious elites become committed to the positions that they adopt in public life. In other words, it's one thing for a religious leader to say to another religious leader in private, oh yeah, we would never threaten your community, or oh yeah, we will always sort of respect your rights. But when it's done in public on a regular basis, institutionalized, those commitments become more credible, right, across religious bounds. I think it builds a set of both material interests and a sort of normative consensus among elites from different slices of the religious landscape. Material interests, what do I mean by that? Well, frequently, for instance, funding streams that are going to health clinics or going to schools promote a set of religious actors across religious boundaries who actually share a preference for having that institutional model sort of continue itself over time. So there is a rational side to it, but I also, in my experience, and I try to document this in the cases in the book, think it extends beyond rational interest, that it extends to a sort of normative consensus that emerges in many of these cases. And then finally, and this I think becomes especially important during moments of crisis or instability, these institutions that encourage regular interaction between state and religious authorities form networks of communication and elite relationships that are easy to mobilize, that are well institutionalized, and that can be activated in moments of potential political crisis. So in other words, because there are strong pre-existing elite ties and also state religious ties, at moments of political instability or potential breakdown in religious politics, these elites know each other, their staff know each other, their organizations have a history of working together, and that kind of networked connectivity can matter a lot in moments of political instability. Okay. And so in the end, these kinds of institutions of benevolent secularism, I try to argue in the book, have been very important to stabilizing the twin tolerations in a pretty diverse set of cases. I'm going to talk just about the Philippines for the most part today. I look at Ireland more historically, and then at Senegal, also a fascinating Muslim-majority democracy in West Africa, as well in the book project, and try to argue that in very different environments, we can trace these institutions having a political effect. And again, so just to put it visually for those who like seeing things, so the idea is that from an institutional challenge, one might have sort of benevolent secular institutions in place, yes or no, that these institutions have effects where you have them present, you have these public commitments, you have shared interests, you have communication networks, and that then in the end, that leads to these stronger social alliances that stabilize the twin tolerations over time. That's the basic idea. Okay, this has been pretty abstract so far. Before actually we get to the Philippines, I can't avoid talking about Senegal for a moment just to illustrate this, because I think this helps maybe to concretize this. So, as some of you may know, Senegal is a sort of democratic overachiever, according to a number of socioeconomic characteristics. It's a place that's been an imperfect but slowly consolidating democracy from independence from French rule through the present, and one that's characterized by laïcité because of the French legacy, but it's a laïcité that has always been understood, I would argue, much closer to the benevolent secular model, that there's an active role for religious leaders, mostly Muslim, but also Catholic, in public life, and that this is something that is a sort of shared normative consensus between religious elites and state elites. Well, in the sort of early 2000s, in the aughts, laïcité in Senegal came under a real challenge, and the twin tolerations in Senegal came under a real challenge. Broadly speaking, the Wade administration was elected with great fanfare, right? It was an alteration of political power from one party to the other, which was very important. But very quickly it became clear that the implications for religious politics could be troubling. Wade circulated a draft constitution which removed language related to laïcité from that constitution. Broadly speaking, there was a sense that he was intending and trying to privilege his own Sufi order. This is Wade on the right here, prostrating himself on state television before the leader of the Murid Sufi Brotherhood, one of the Sufi Brotherhoods in Senegal. And there was a sense that Wade was breaking down this principled distance, that he was seeking to build particularly strong ties with the Murids, who were his own people, to the exclusion both of other Sufi orders, but also potentially to the Catholic minority. Right? This all came to a sort of a head around the contentious final election of Wade's career. Well, at that time, final election. He may be coming back. And the thing that was interesting for the theory, right, was that in this moment of a sort of contentious election that involved religious politics being put under some strain, these mechanisms sort of snapped into operation. A network of religious and secular NGOs in civil society, both Muslim and Catholic and sort of not particularly religious, organized itself under the heading of what was known as the Assise Nationale, and issued a platform, a charter on democratic governance it covered a lot of ground. It was not just about religion, but included no, there it is. Maybe not. That included a platform plank on Laïcité, on restoring Laïcité in public life. And in fact, during the closing days of the campaign, when Wad made a bid to try to get an endorsement, a formal political endorsement from the Mouride Caliph, the sort of Mouride leadership stepped back. They didn't, of course, direct their people not to vote for him, but they wouldn't give him the endorsement that he was looking for in the closing days of the campaign. And what I try to trace in the book is that the reason that this response, right, to this instability in Senegal was so effective from religious and civil society was because of these pre-existing relationships tied to the religion-state relationship in Senegal over the course of the past sort of 50 years or so preceding this, right? It's just one illustration. Let's talk about the Philippines now. First, how this framework maps onto just kind of the background of religion in Philippine democracy and then to the current moment there. As many of you may know, it's sort of commonly remarked that the Philippines is the only Catholic country in Asia. This is both with Timor-Leste's independence inaccurate and also sort of incomplete, right? It's not even the most Catholic country in Asia anymore. It's roughly 80% Catholic, probably a touch above. Significant other Christian minorities. Some of those are sort of mainline, what we would think of as mainline Protestant denominations tied to colonialism. Some of them are more recent charismatic and Pentecostal and evangelical churches that have spread in the past 20 years or so. It's worth noting that that percentage has not grown nearly as rapidly as, for instance, in parts of Latin America. So sometimes it's remarked that Philippine political development looks a lot like Latin America's, and it does in some ways, but you haven't seen the explosion of Pentecostalism, for instance, in the Philippines that you have in parts of Latin America. The Catholic Church has maintained pretty clear demographic predominance. And of course, the Muslim minority, probably a little bit north of 5% of the population. Demographics are contentious because that population is concentrated on the island of Mindanao, which is itself an active conflict zone. And so our demographics aren't great, but that's probably roughly where the landscape is. As I opened up the talk actually mentioning, in some ways, the Philippines is a sort of ideal typification of this model of benevolent secularism and one of the key cases from the third wave of democratization where religious actors are seen as really central to stabilizing democratic politics, right? So in other words, why does the People Power Revolution go so relatively smoothly in 1986? Well, one of the answers that you frequently hear is because cardinal sin in the church stabilized what could have been a very violent confrontation between the regime and the military, right? And I think there's some truth to that historically, and I talk about some of that in the book. It's an incomplete story, right? The revolution did not just happen because of the church, but the church was a very important contributor to, not just the Catholic Church, actually also different Protestant communities were very important contributors to that stable transition. It is also the case that postcard version of religion and politics in the Philippines that the church, especially the Catholic Church, sometimes like to tell about itself, has always allowed for more conflict under the surface, especially recently, actually. So I'm going to talk about tensions between President Duterte and different religious leaders, especially the institutional Catholic Church. But under the previous administration of the son of the legendary Cory Aquino, there was a significant conflict between the institutional church especially and Aquino's Liberal Party over a piece of reproductive health legislation that the Catholic Bishops' Conference was very much opposed to. And so there's always been some contention built into the relationship. But I would argue, and actually this I do talk about a lot in the book, even during the RH law debates, with the reproductive health law, known as the RH law, even during those debates, while it's true that the Catholic Church didn't get its way, the trademarks of benevolent secularism were very much visible. So in other words, you had consultations between the institutional church and political elites. You had different churches being brought in and the Muslim community being brought in. This wasn't just about Catholicism. It was about a kind of principled distance between the government and its different religious communities. And that those consultations actually mattered to the legislation, that there were substantive changes made in this legislation, especially around how it would be rolled out through religious hospitals and schools, that actually showed the endurance of benevolent secularism even during that controversy, right? I think that it's that pattern of cooperation that has come under some question in the past 12 to 18 months in the Philippines. Many of you, I'm sure, are basically familiar with this, so I won't belabor it in too much detail, but in May 2016, President Duterte is clearly elected, although with a minority of the popular vote because of a fragmented political landscape. But he clearly wins out over the more sort of conventional mainstream national politicians. Mar Rojas coming out of the Aquino sort of political machine, and other rivals, Grace Poe and Binay. When he's elected, he's mostly known, insofar as he's known internationally, as the longtime mayor of Davao City, one of the largest cities in the Philippines outside of the Metro Manila area, right? The largest city on the island of Mindanao. And so this kind of persona and political career as a Manila outsider is very important to his political rise, but also important to his political rise is a kind of contentious public agenda, and an unapologetically so contentious public agenda. He runs promising to bring his get tough on crime approach to the war on drugs to the national level. He runs promising constitutional reform, especially designed to decrease the power of what's sometimes called imperial Manila in Philippine politics, and increase federal decentralization of power. And on a few issues, he actually runs on issues that give some hope to sort of progressives in the Philippines, including within the Philippine religious landscape. He's seen as somebody who has credibility to push forward peace negotiations, both with Muslim rebels and also with the left, the sort of enduring leftist insurgency in the Philippines. And he's also seen as someone who is no friend of mining companies, which is a major environmental issue in the Philippines. So this is the agenda that he brings into office. In terms of his relationship to religion, it's fair to say that even before he becomes president, it's a contentious one, right? Some of you may have heard about this quote in light of Pope Francis's visit to Manila. Duterte used a popular and vulgar term to refer to the Pope. He really was referring to the traffic that the Pope caused, but which is, in fairness, probably a reasonable enough thing to be irritated about. But still, the path to the Philippine presidency has not tended to involve using a vulgarity to refer to the Bishop of Rome. So there is sort of a tense pre-existing personal history. It's also important to note that it is personal also in the sense that he alleges having been the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of a Jesuit priest, an American Jesuit priest actually, in his adolescent years, right? So there are personal sort of tensions there. It's not just about the policy agenda. Before the election, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, the CBCP, was clearly quite concerned about his likely election. They did not explicitly name him in their pre-election statement. But they also clearly set out a set of policy concerns about both personal morality, which was meant to refer to his sort of comments about women and actions towards women at times, but also the war on drugs that were designed to express their grave concern. Didn't matter, right? In the end, he wins election anyway. It is worth noting that some of his sort of long-term partners in governance around Mindanao, especially in Davao, including within the Catholic Church, were quite supportive of him early on and really thought that, no, you guys are getting him wrong, right? He's going to present an opportunity, especially on environmental politics and peace negotiations. So Father Joel Tabora is the president of Ateneo, not Manila University, but the Ateneo University in Davao. And he was an enthusiastic supporter of the president early on, especially for his appointments to the ministry regarding the environment. So there was potentially some optimism. But very quickly, tensions between not just the Catholic Church, although primarily the Catholic Church, and the administration grew. And they particularly grew because of the very rapid rollout of a sort of militarized approach to anti-narcotics operations by the administration. Without getting into too much of the details, already Human Rights Watch estimates that at least 13,000 individuals have been killed in these operations. The majority of these are not killed in official police operations. The majority of these are killed in shadowy vigilante killings, which many assume are tied in some way to the police force, but are not documented to be so. Although with the recently launched ICC investigation, we'll see what sort of becomes documented. There's no doubt that this is the main source of tension between, in terms of policy, between Duterte and the CVCP. It's also fair to say that the sort of declaration of martial law across Mindanao in response to the ISIS takeover, or the ISIS-affiliated group takeover of Marawi City, has raised some concern. That word martial law carries a serious legacy in Philippine political circles and religious circles. And while I think most were quite supportive of the need to respond to the invasion of Marawi, martial law has been renewed many times. It's enforced not just in that part of the island, but extended across the island, and there are concerns about its potential extension across the rest of the country. And then also some of those issues tied to environment and peace negotiations, I won't go into too much depth of this, but have really stalled. Right? So after some optimism on both of those fronts, things have really actually slowed to a crawl as the administration has essentially prioritized these first two sets of issues, especially the war on drugs, but also the military response to the situation in Mindanao, and I think largely been ineffective and distracted at pushing through its, I think, probably sincere desire to make some progress on environmental issues and peace negotiations. So this tension has been brewing. What I would argue is that actually this is not just a tension that's about politics and the war on drugs, but it's actually started to bleed over into the institutional sort of relationship between religion and state. So for instance, a series of witnesses to police-involved shootings tied to the drug wars have started to seek sanctuary with sympathetic clerics. Right? This has led to high-ranking Justice Department officials in the Philippines threatening to prosecute clerics who are involved in harboring witnesses. This hasn't been followed through on, right? But this also isn't just anyone making this threat. This is a cabinet-level official saying this. There have been threats toward religious broadcasters. So the Catholic Church's radio network, Radio Veritas, is a very important piece of infrastructure that the Catholic Church has. It played a role in the People Power Revolution in 1986. It's how Cardinal Sin broadcasted his call for people to come into the streets. The House of Representatives, which is controlled by Duterte and his political allies, has not revoked the license to operate, but has so far failed to renew the license to operate for Radio Veritas. We'll see what comes of that. It's part of a broader set of threatened anti-media freedom actions that have been percolating over the last few months. And then finally, there have been a few very high-profile cases of grassroots religious activists, not just Catholic and tied to Protestant communities, who have been killed by local power elites probably in sort of punishment for their local activism challenging local clientelist power structures. And this has frustrated a number of people within the national level religious leadership. Right? So in other words, I wouldn't say that this has deteriorated to a full-blown crisis for the twin tolerations yet, but it's not just rhetoric. There are sort of concrete institutional pieces that are starting to shift in the Philippines. Okay, well, my framework says, or the ideas I tried to develop in the book say, that there should be some responses here. We should see these coalition actors, both Catholic but not just Catholic, responding to this breakdown in the twin tolerations. We have seen some of this. So over the course of his year plus in office, the churches, not just the Catholic Church, also members of minority Christian churches, have become much more vocal and not just rhetorical, but also action-oriented in some of their protests to anti-narcotic operations. There have been a series of rallies, both involving the Catholic Church and also involving different Christian minority churches. There's been institutionalized bell ringing, so ringing of the bells of churches around the country. They actually just today announced a new set of protests in 2 weeks that I think is going to be more explicitly tied just to Catholic actors. So there's been more protest, and importantly, not just religious actors, but also religious actors cooperating with secular portions of civil society in all of this, right? So working with human rights advocacy groups that would not think of themselves as religious organizations, but share interests in this space. There's been close cooperation between the institutional church and the Commission on Human Rights, which is a semi-governmental organization in the Philippines written into the post-revolutionary constitution to monitor human rights. There's been cooperation between that commission and religious actors, which became actually particularly important when the House of Representatives threatened to defund the Commission on Human Rights. So Duterte's allies in the House initially floated a budget that zeroed out the funding for the Commission on Human Rights, or nearly zeroed it out. And religious actors sort of rallied to its defense. So again, these kind of coalition alliances are operating to an extent. And around now the question of constitutional revision. So the revisions to the post-People Power Constitution of 1987, which Duterte's administration seems to be really pushing now. That's his sort of main public priority right now into the new year. You've seen sort of engagement between religious actors and the good governance organizations that you would expect to be very concerned with technicalities of how do you reform the Constitution, what does it mean for term limits, what does it mean for federal structures, and all of that. So I would argue that all of this is actually broadly consistent with what we might expect. And importantly, all of these involve partnerships that pre-exist to the Duterte administration because the Philippine religion-state relationship encourages these partnerships on a regular basis. So in other words, most of the folks leading these organizations have worked with each other for decades, many of them stretching back actually even to the revolution in '86. They have those strong pre-existing networks of communication. They have a set of, I think, sincere normative preferences that have a lot of overlap, and that has made them able to respond in this unstable environment. So that's part of the story that I think holds up okay. But I think that the other part of the story that has to be told is that it's not clear if these responses are going to matter right now in the Philippines. I think Philippine politics the future is very uncertain right now. On the one hand, there have been some assurances from the president's office, for instance, that constitutional revision will not mean extending his term in office. So in other words, there have been, now again, who knows if this will stick by this, although I tend to think he will. So there have been some attempts to assure the bishops and other religious groups, no, we're just going to introduce a form of federalism. We're not going to destabilize the stability of democratic institutions and the broader religion-state relationship. Some of this is going on. A lot of this is actually through informal channels of communication, which are very symptomatic of benevolent secularism. So three in particular of Duterte's sort of senior allies, including the secretary of his cabinet, Joe Navasco, are either clerics or were in seminary at some point in time and have strong personal ties to the institutional church. But there's no doubt that there's real tension between religious actors and the executive branch over the war on drugs in particular, and there's no real evidence that that's doing anything to his overall popularity rating. Now, survey research in this kind of an environment has its limitations. I actually do a good bit of survey research. I'm happy to talk more about this, but after a little bit of a drop in the third or fourth round of survey work that Social Weather Stations did, his approval rating has bounced right back up, and he appears to have really robust public support for most of these policies. And it's not clear, and I think it's also not clear to the bishops in the Philippines and to the other religious actors who are concerned, whether they can swing public opinion on this issue, to be honest, or not. This is sort of news from actually just the past couple of weeks. So the newest revision in the policy, and who knows, is this sort of a good thing or a bad thing? I tend to think it's very cynical. The announcement was that police officers involved in these operations, Tokang operations, should be carrying Bibles and rosaries with them as they go about their business to assure the people that actually they come with the best of intentions and aren't there to just execute them in cold blood. right? Is this benevolent secularism in action? I actually tend to think not. I tend to think that this is a fairly cynical move by the administration. And I think, just to sort of step back out to the general level for a last slide here, that what this points to is a few things in the overall framework that I tried to argue in the book that probably need to be revisited or at least thought more about. One is that even in highly religious societies like the Philippines, the fact is that demand for religious influence in politics is not automatic. And just because a population is highly religiously devout doesn't mean they care what the bishop says. Now, of course, the bishops know this, right? But sometimes this is news to political scientists. I think sometimes political scientists think that religious people are sort of Pavlov's holy dogs, and sort of when the religious authority rings the bell, they respond. Well, the fact is that survey research in the Philippines, for instance, shows that even weekly attenders, even among just Catholics, are actually quite reluctant to express support for religious leader influence over government decisions. They're sort of 19% only of weekly attenders will say that it's a weird question wording, will say they disagree with the idea that religious leaders should not influence government, right? And weekly attenders are no more likely to disagree than those who attend less than weekly, right? There's no meaningful gap there. So the idea that there's sort of some pious Catholic majority that's just latently waiting for the bishops to, to sort of exert leadership and will automatically respond, I think the reality is more complex than that. And at a theoretical level, the links between elites and average citizens is something that I think as scholars, but also as policy practitioners, we need to pay more attention to, right? The idea that, that the lived reality of religion in politics is much more complex than what elite bodies may put out as their statements. Second, I don't exactly know how this fits into the framework, but it's a phenomenon that's going on, and not just in the Philippines, but it's been interesting to track there. Sort of the influence of this era of fake news and social media trolling and manufactured reality that we all inhabit has on religious authority. So President Duterte has very effectively assembled a sort of online apparatus to engage in the kinds of questionable news propagation that we've seen in a lot of contexts recently, right? And this has involved also sort of aggressive attacks online on opponents, right? Sort of discrediting and et cetera, et cetera. Religious leaders have gotten very much caught up in this in the Philippines. So there was a set of allegations made against a bishop that were not actually new rumors, as far as I understand it. Rumors had been around, but they sort of moved into this online environment in a very aggressive way. I think that just, I don't know, as I was thinking about this talk, it raises questions about the future effectiveness of religious elites in this kind of current environment that we information environment that we inhabit. And then finally, the sort of, whether you want to call it a populist moment or a nationalist moment or some combination of those two things that is going on in the Philippines right now, and also going on in Turkey and Russia, here at home, and in Western Europe and Central Europe. I think that it is, I haven't thought this through, but it's a different set of questions about the relationship between religion and democracy than we had maybe 10 years ago. The question isn't, will the religious majority try to take over the state institutions, right? In most of these the cases that I just mentioned, that's just not the relevant question anymore. It seems to me the relevant question actually is, will secular state elites totally co-opt the religious landscape in order to build up their own populist movement? We've seen moves in this direction in Russia, in Turkey, analytically, I would argue, in the United States. Duterte joked actually once that he's just going to found the Church of Duterte, right? So I don't care what the bishops say. I'm founding the Church of Duterte, and you all should just come believe in me. He was joking, right? He's actually a pretty funny guy. But I think it gets at something of this broader trend towards religious elites, secular political elites, very effectively, in some contexts, instrumentalizing religious leaders to support their populist movements. That is just a different analytic question than I think most comparative political scientists were asking even 10 years ago. Right? The question isn't, is a traditional religious elite going to take over state institutions? I think it's much more, will these populist movements so thoroughly co-opt religious actors and even promote their own preferred religious actors that they become indistinguishable from the regime in power. And I think there's a lot of room for thinking about that going forward. So I will leave it at that for now. Thank you all. Oh, yeah, cheers. Couldn't resist. I couldn't resist. Although I think that this isn't just a sort of Philippine question. I think this is a broader question. And it's also a question about how these local religious dynamics, even in periods of kind of optimism, like the People Power Revolution, we're always tied up in a broader geostrategic environment that is just changing very rapidly too, right? I mean, there's no doubt that there's been a change in American rhetoric towards the administration in Manila since our own political transition. The broader sort of regional international power dynamics need to be factored in here as well. Okay, I'll hush up and take a seat and look forward to